The slogan of existentialism is existence precedes essence. The notion of essences was created by Plato some 2,000 years ago. The essence of something is a set of one or many traits that determine what kind of thing an object is, explain how it functions, and provide it a purpose. For example, say the essence of a knife is a tool with a sharp blade and a handle. It may not matter, which is to say, be essential to knifehood, whether its handle is made of wood, metal, or leather, so long as it has a handle. The essence serves to classify a tool as a knife rather than a fork or spoon, and explains why knives cut things. When Plato conceived of essences, he thought that there existed a secondary world beyond our experience called the world of forms. The world of forms contained the essences of all objects, the ideal of every kind, including the essence of knifehood. Every knife in our world is to be evaluated against the knife in the world of forms. Whereas a good knife is similar to its essence, a bad knife is dissimilar to its essence. And every knife in our world has its purpose in resembling the ideal knife, which is in the world of form. The same schema applies for every object in our world. Everything, whether a cup, chair, or person, has the purpose of being like its essence, which is in the world of form. This means that everything in the universe, extended to humans, has a purpose. The purpose to perfectly exemplify its kind. The human purpose is to embody the human ideal, whatever that may be. It is a purpose that comes with the essence that existentialists are really concerned with. An adjunct way of there being a human purpose is if there were ultimate, objective, universal values to strive for, alongside principles that we ought to follow. This would provide a human ideal, a purpose for all humans to follow. For example, if God actually bestowed the 10 Commandments to all humans such that we were subject to divine reward and punishment according to whether we followed them, then there would be clear constraints on how to live and ideals to aspire to. This would amount to a purpose. Or even an atheistic moral principle like maximizing general well-being while minimizing overall suffering would provide a purpose, a utilitarian purpose. This sort of moral principle, if objectively correct and practical in deliberation, constrains the scope of action in any circumstance and provides human ideals. Again, this would constitute a purpose. As told by Sartre, humans could only have a purpose, whether by an ultimate value or an essence, if they were crafted by some inventor, like God. But there is no God to bestow us with a purpose, so we don't have one. Without God, humans are a tiny blip, a coincidence of evolution on Earth, which is itself a nothingness when considered against the infinite expanse of the universe. From the perspective of the universe, it's weird to say that there's a purpose to any of this. If you've ever looked out at the night sky and realized how tiny you and everything that you care about is, you know exactly what I'm talking about. In his book, The Stranger, Camus famously said, "I looked up at the mass of signs and stars in the world and laid myself open for the first time to the benign indifference of the world." Even if there were a God, our separation from God makes it impossible to know about God or to know what God would want from us. The plethora of religious doctrines and interpretations makes this problem especially pernicious. Even if there were a God who gave us some sacred text, we don't know which religion contains God's word nor how to interpret it. The job of forming a purpose would be left to us by our human choice of what religion to follow and how to follow it. Therefore, even if some God bestowed us with a purpose, we can't know what that purpose is. However, our existence, the fact that we are and are aware that we are in every single moment, is certain. It is the most, if not only, self-evident fact. This is to say that our existence precedes any nature, purpose, or essence. We are both born without a predetermined purpose and in any moment exist without a settled path into the next moment. In Sartre's words, man first of all exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards. This is the meaning of the slogan, existence precedes essence. And yet, we engage in a continuous attempt to create our own essence, to build a solid, stable, knowable thing called me. We want to say, I am an athlete, or I am a philosopher, or I am a vegan, and really mean something, not just about our past, but about who we really are, our authentic nature and our purpose in the world, not just today, but tomorrow, and in a year and 10 years from now. However, so long as we live, this work remains incomplete. The scope of freedom means that you could, in any moment, choose a different course. You could be a vegan of 15 years and then suddenly decide to pick up your phone and order a cheeseburger. Then with the cheeseburger in hand, you could decide to eat it, you could decide to put it down, throw it away, or throw it at the wall, or do anything else with it. No matter how committed one is to be a defined thing with a specified purpose in the world, their freedom means that they always have to wrestle with choices that determine who they are in the next moment. This job is never complete. Most existentialists are committed to the notion that there is nothing that completely determines what we do, and by extension, who we are. In other words, in every action, my freedom is the thing that moves the needle, not some prior determining cause. According to Sartre, even seemingly determined behaviors like eating when hungry result inextricably from freedom. You eat when you're hungry not because you're determined to do so, but because you've made a choice to value satiety. Without valuing the feeling of fullness and positing eating as the means to promote this end, hunger would just be, well, a sensory experience. It would be meaningless and fail to drive you to eat. A choice of values always subtly undergirds our actions, even those we don't seem to choose. We are responsible for the values that we choose, so we are responsible for all of our resulting actions. I can, in any moment, espouse any value and take any course of action, and I am entirely responsible for this process. This does not mean, strictly speaking, that one can will any action into being. A boy bound to a wheelchair, no matter how hard he tries, cannot will himself to stand or will himself into the NBA, but he can will himself to try every therapy and treatment program and commit his life to lobbying for wheelchair-bound people's right to join the NBA. If he didn't commit his life to these values, it would be apt, by this view, to claim he didn't actually value standing up or joining the NBA. It's a harsh view where freedom and responsibility are paramount, but in a world where our present actions create the future, the existentialists think it's not only apt, but that it's right. Thus, our existence becomes defined by a peculiar predicament. We find ourselves with a freedom and responsibility that is seemingly endless. We're presented with choices in every single moment, from the minute what breakfast to eat or whether to like this video, you should by the way, to the existential, who to marry, what to study, and what career to pursue. Each decision, no matter how small, determines who you are, your very essence, and yet you're left without a guide. In Sartre's words, man is condemned to be free. In every moment, we are like a traveler coming up to a crossroads, paths sprawling out every which way but with no directions. This conflict between our freedom and a lack of guidance is what existentialists call, among other names, absurdity. Absurdity, broadly defined, is an ever-present and deeply disparaging conflict between our psychological need for reasons, values, and meaning to guide our freedom and the absence of reasons, values, and meaning found in the world. According to the existentialists, absurdity is our central psychological source of suffering. It leaves us feeling abandoned in a foreign world, full of fear and anxiety. On the search for meaning, values, and purpose, which is human life, we are condemned to come up empty, to fail. Any values we may find are ultimately illusory, rooted in false hope or self-deception. The world's disorder, cruelty, pointlessness, and irrationality go against everything that we seem to need from it. It is as though the world simply isn't fit for beings with our sorts of minds. The question of how to respond to absurdity is unavoidable the moment we become aware of the problem. Luckily, existentialist philosophers agree upon how not to respond. As a composite image of the incorrect response, imagine somebody who, whenever they can, scrolls on social media, consuming themselves in anything stimulating. They allow their behavior to be determined by whatever provides the next dopamine hit, attending to whatever is compelling without making choices of their own. When confronted with options, they offload their freedom, whether to parents, technology, religion, or even science. In other words, they do what some authority, whether their mom, a fitness watch, their favorite influencer, or a pastor, tells them to, instead of choosing actions for themselves. Rather than espousing and committing to values through their actions, they're passively tossed around by an ocean of desires and emotions. When angry, they vent on Twitter. When horny, they go to Tinder or internet porn. Then, when confronted with why they did something, they deny their freedom, making an excuse. They make a false appeal to a prior cause or otherwise claim that they're acting in accordance with what is objectively demanded, according to some irreducible but ultimately false explanation. They say that situations and people made them feel certain ways which made them act as they did. Thus, they are passive respondents to an uncontrolled and uncontrollable environment. As important as their freedom may be, the fear of freely choosing actions and values is so great that they would rather deny their freedom to begin with. They choose passive irresponsibility to avoid the torment of choice, responsibility, and absurdity. However, this sort of life, in an attempt to be a determined object, is utterly nihilistic. It's a denial of life, at least as the existentialists view life, arguably no better than suicide. And yet it may be where we all start out. Luckily, there are many ways to move forward from this point. Kierkegaard views absurdity as an issue of values. To Kierkegaard, if we knew what to value, it would give our freedom structure, and we would have a purpose. In Kierkegaard's philosophy, there are 4 progressions in response to absurdity. As outlined in the How Not to Respond section, the aesthete allows themselves to be determined by whatever external forces are most captivating or compelling at the moment. One step improved is the ethical person. The ethical person recognizes a higher capability in human beings. They recognize the universality of our predicament and notice a capacity for higher experiences. They seek to do what is rational and adopt values that sometimes put their actions at conflict with what the environment would otherwise entice them to do. Therefore, as the ethical person commits to a value, they commit against a world that tempts them to do otherwise. Sorry for the change of scenery. I just realized while editing this video that I never really, for some reason, cared to explain what values are and what committing to values does in terms of resolving absurdity. So for Kierkegaard, a value is going to be anything that you would normally think of as a value. So strength, courage, discipline, creative expression, helping other people. These are all values, right? So anything that you would normally think of as a value is going to be, for Kierkegaard, something that can be a value. So a value is just going to be something that an individual experiences as being especially important. If you imagine somebody who's generally selfish and egocentric and only really cares about themselves and everything that they don't really do much for other people, they never really help other people or donate to charity or any of these sorts of things. And then suddenly something comes over them and they decide to, help an old lady cross the street. And then they have a certain sort of experience. They have a certain sort of pleasurable experience or worthwhile or meaningful experience. And now they realize, oh shit, helping people is important. I should do this more. So they recognize helping people to be important, and then they might live more of their life according to this value of helping people. So for Kierkegaard, a value is something that we recognize through our experience as being important or meaningful. So to commit to a value is just to say, here's this thing that is important. I am going to live to try to uphold this thing that's important, right? So helping other people is important. I'm going to try to help people. Or strength is important. I'm going to be strong. Or courage is important. I'm going to be courageous, right? This is what it means to live upholding a value. And then what does that do in terms of resolving absurdity, you might wonder? Well, absurdity is the conflict between our need for guidance and directions and reasons and purpose, and then the lack of all of those in the world. In upholding a value, let's say beneficence, it's going to give me certain directions when I'm posed with options, when I'm uncertain on how I should direct my freedom, what I should attend to, what I should do. I can consult my value, and it's going to point me in a certain direction. So let's say my value was helping other people, beneficence. Now when deciding between, let's say, 2 areas of study, between doing computational design on the one hand and psychology, where I then, let's say, plan to be a therapist and help lots of people in therapy, now I can offload this choice to my value, helping people, and it's gonna point me to being a therapist and studying psychology. So this is why values resolve absurdity. Or as a sort of joking example, let's say somebody just recognized that money was their core value, that accumulating wealth was the most important thing in the world to them. Then when consulted with any choice, whether what to order at a restaurant, what job to take, whether to move, what to study, so on and so forth. They can consult this value of wealth, and the value is going to point them in one direction or another. And the absurdity, the question of what to choose and why to choose it, is resolved. So the idea of the ethical person is they're sort of taking this first step towards their values. So they recognize something that's important, helping people, and they're trying to help people through their actions. They're trying to uphold their value through their actions. However, they're not always able to do this. We had the example of the person who helped the old lady cross the street. They recognize helping people is important, and now they're trying to help people, but sometimes they cave to their egocentric desires. Or maybe they're recognizing other things as valuable. Maybe they're recognizing the next day they see the sunset and they're just like blown away by its beauty, and they're like, how have I never noticed? How have I never taken the time to appreciate beauty in nature? So maybe at the same time they're recognizing aesthetic beauties through nature and art, and they're trying to live according to that. So their values are changing. They're sort of in flux. And so the main point is that they are making this attempt to live according to values, but they haven't chosen their core values and haven't really made a full commitment to them, if this makes sense. Whereas the other progressions, which we'll get to, they make a further commitment to their values. However, the ethical person has only made the first progression. They're still partially determined by their environment, and they lack structure to their values. They may sometimes cave to self-interest and be tossed around by passions and desires. Their ethical map, as it were, is subject to change, and their selfhood, formed according to their resistance to the world, may be unstable and lose unification. The next progression, the Night of Infinite Resignation, transcends the limitations of the ethical person. They make a self-determined, undying commitment to their values. Their goal is impenetrable, absolutely stable in the face of any and all setbacks and temptations. Critically, their commitment cannot be made by rationality alone. In other words, their value cannot be chosen nor reified according to reason. Rather, it is a leap of faith by virtue of the absurd. This is to say that they leverage the unreasonability of the world to form a commitment that is itself unreasonable. And going beyond the finitudes, contingencies, and conditions of their environment, the Night of Infinite Resignation moves beyond the finite into the infinite. They form an eternal self that is impervious to their conditions, and in resistance to the world, they lose the world or the plane of the finite. This is to say that they lose their ability to seamlessly or casually partake with the plethora of standard experiences we find within life. It is as though they leap into another realm, the infinite, where they dodge the existentiality of the finite, but they're still physically bound to our finite world, so they must land. When they land, however, they do so somewhat awkwardly. In other words, they can't quite fit into normal human affairs. To make this tangible with a real-life example, take David Goggins. So that was such resistance. Oh man. Let's say he has a commitment to the values of strength and discipline. These values guide Goggins to do things other than that which his environment entices, right? So, for example, when his bed is beckoning him to sleep in, his values guide him to go for a run instead. So, his values put him at resistance with what the world entices him to do. Take his values, these infinite values. They're up here in this plane of infinity. It's as though these values are in this platonic realm that we were talking about at the beginning of the video. Now, he's operating in this world of the finite where there's beds, there's TV, there's yummy breakfast, there's all these sensuous pleasures that we have, right? And so as he makes this commitment to this infinite value way up here, he's making this leap. He's making this leap to the infinite. However, when he makes this leap, he's rejecting everything in the finite. He's rejecting his bed. He's rejecting the yummy breakfast, the sleeping in, the sensuous pleasures of all sorts, right? So he's losing the finite and gaining the infinite, right? So in upholding his values infinitely through all his acts, he acts in resistance to the world. In doing so, Kierkegaard tells us that the Night of Infinite Resignation loses the world. Something about his existence, as it's bound to the finite world, isn't quite natural. It might be too serious or a little bit clunky. For example, imagine David Goggins trying to make small talk with a barista or shopping at a department store. There's just something unseemly about how the Night of Infinite Resignation lives in the finite world. However, The Night of Infinite Resignation is no longer subject to absurdity. They now have values to guide their freedom, such that in any moment of existential angst, they have directions. Kierkegaard tells us that we can have multiple values, so long as they're ranked in an order. When the primary value doesn't serve as a guide, we can reference the secondary value, then the third, and so on, until there's guidance on every single decision. It's important that these values be ordered. This way they don't conflict with one another, which would bring us back to absurdity, right? So if we valued, let's say, strength and family equally, and strength pulled me this way, but family pulled me this way, then they would conflict, and we'd be left with absurdity. We'd be left without direction. So they need to be in a strict order where we put one in front of the other, and then only when the first one doesn't guide us, we go to the second one. The Night of Faith, the last progression that Kierkegaard proposes, goes one step further than the Night of Infinite Resignation. Alongside their infinite commitment to their values, the Night of Faith can seamlessly integrate within the finite world, right? They don't lose all those sensuous pleasures. They don't lose the bed. They don't lose their ability to make small talk with the priest. So all this finite, contingent stuff that, we're all doing down here. All right. The way that they do this is through a belief in God, formed, quote-unquote, by virtue of the absurd. Kierkegaard believes that God's existence goes against everything that we know about the material world. However, by once again leveraging the unreasonability of the world and the limits of our understanding, the Night of Faith makes the ultimate leap of faith. Through absurdity, they reconcile God's impossibility with an unwavering commitment to God. Through an absurd belief in God, they affirm and embrace life despite its insoluble paradoxes. Their joy is in existence in their bed or eating that yummy breakfast because the world of the finite exists in relation to God, and they see it through God's eyes. They subordinate reason to faith through an irrational commitment to God. It's confusing. It's confusing to me. If it's not confusing to you, you probably aren't understanding it, but it's confusing because it's paradoxical. And that is the very point. It's an absurd reasoning to respond to an absurd condition, right? We have this fundamentally, absurd condition where our psychology, our minds, just the way we operate, our nature, if you will, contradicts fundamentally with the world. We want something fundamentally that the world will not provide. We want guidance. We want reasons. We want values. We want purpose. And the world is cold. It's indifferent. It doesn't give us anything in response to our cries. We cry to the world, and the world is just silent. And we keep crying because that's what we're condemned to do in some sense, right? And so it's an absurd condition. It doesn't make sense. And so Kierkegaard is just saying, to hell with all this purely logical, rational reasoning. I'm going to use an absurd reasoning. We're in an unreasonable condition. We need an unreasonable response. So through this unreasonable response, Kierkegaard likely proposes the only complete solution to absurdity. But as we were just talking about, one might worry about the rationality or reasonability of some steps in this progression, namely the irrationality of avowing a single value above everything else, and committing oneself to faith in God. Luckily, Camus takes up this concern in his response to absurdity. In Camus' philosophy, we lack ultimate knowledge of everything in the universe. This leaves all decisions, let alone values, arbitrary with respect to truth. Any proposed solution to absurdity that irrationally commits to values is nothing but an attempt to deny the absurd condition of our lives. In Camus' world, we cannot honestly avoid absurdity, but must instead take it as the most fundamental fact from which all other inquiry begins. In his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus makes the case that death makes a mockery of our repetitive, habit-governed lives. We're like Sisyphus in the famous Greek myth, endlessly pushing a boulder up a mountain just for it to fall down day after day, one day after another, right? Every day we wake up around the same time by our alarm clock, we have some coffee, we eat our breakfast, we go to work, take a lunch break, we do some more work, we go home, we have dinner, we might see some friends, we might have a drink, we turn on the TV, then we do it over, and we do it over, and we do it over and over and over and over and over, and then we die. And there's no point to any of it, right? This is basically the structure of the thought. And in this sense, we're like Sisyphus in the famous Greek myth, just pushing a boulder up a mountain, fruitless pursuit one day after another that never amounts to anything. And we do this, we're condemned to this condition for the rest of our lives, right? Every day of our life, we're condemned to do the same pointless dance. And the resulting experience, when confronted honestly, for Camus, is void of that which would make it worth living. So why don't we kill ourselves, right? This is Camus' curiosity. Why should we live? Why don't we kill ourselves? Why do we every morning choose to have that cup of coffee instead of committing suicide? He asks the question, Should I kill myself or have a cup of coffee? And every day we come up with the same answer. Why? This is the essential question taken up in the book The Myth of Sisyphus. So for Camus, absurdity is not just a lack of purpose, but an inability to reason ourselves to a unified and meaningful existence at all. In other words, to make sense of just anything whatsoever. The psychological need for a coherent, understandable, and meaningful existence contrasted with the coldness, indifference, and inherent inexplicability of our existence results in absurdity. As compared to Kierkegaard, Camus bears a greater commitment to rationality and reasons, but he's just utterly pessimistic regarding what it affords us, right? So in other words, he's committed to paving a rational path through life, but is skeptical regarding this possibility. If philosophy and science could provide all the answers, tell us what's meaningful, and provide coherence to the world, we might be redeemed. However, these are descriptive enterprises, and so their explanations bottom out at a certain point, leaving crucial whys unanswered. For example, science can tell us ways of living that promote well-being and effective charities that eliminate suffering, but it can't tell us why well-being or suffering matter ultimately. The more we commit to honest rationality without presupposing values, the more inexplicable and foreign the world we find ourselves within becomes. Even the most familiar objects, from ourselves to rocks, escape our knowledge, escape our ultimate conceptual grasp. Considering his commitment to rationality and absurdism, Camus cannot back Kierkegaard's solution to absurdity, which is non-rationally espousing values and faith, as we talked about. Right, so Camus calls this response philosophical suicide. It's a sort of intellectual betrayal, a life of self-deception continued by nothing other than false hope for something that is not and cannot be. He says of Kierkegaard himself, the entire effort of his intelligence is to escape the antimony of the human condition, right? The human condition being absurdity, and the escaping the antimony of the human condition being espousing values and espousing faith. Camus considers false hope, whether hoping for heaven, ultimate values, or a happy future, the most commonly taken alternative to physical suicide. Absurdity for Camus remains unsolvable, but not unrevoltable. Camus insists that revolt is the only reasonable response to absurdity. If absurdity means there's no purpose or reason for anything at all, revolting absurdity means doing everything possible in the face of its meaninglessness. There's something almost petty about this response as I see it. I imagine by analogy a kid told that they can't eat cookies and asking their parents why, to which they're hit with the infamous, well, because I told you so. The child's experience becomes inexplicable, and everything that they want from the world becomes barred off without reason. That's just how it is, they're told. How does the child revolt against the inexplicable condition condemned by the authority that rules over their existence? By eating all the cookies possible, right? If absurdity results in anxious paralysis, revolting absurdity means a pursuit and embrace of every single varied experience. In response to the strict, exceptionless rule that every pursuit is utterly meaningless in the face of death, Camus tells us to do it all with a smile, while holding an unshakable awareness, the reality there's no reason for any of it. This is Camus' revolt against absurdity. As with the rest of the existentialists, Sartre's absurdity is at bottom a problem related to freedom. However, for Sartre, absurdity is made infinitely worse by the responsibility that comes with freedom. As beings with desires and aversions, we're placed in a world that will either fulfill or frustrate these. For Sartre, everything in the world gets its meaning in relation to each individual's aims, values, fears, and wants. In other words, we're striving beings, placed in a world full of objects that define the success or failure of our strivings, of ourselves. The objects in the world get their meaning in relationship to the subject striving. For example, as someone who wants to eat, I bestow an apple with a particular meaning, a fit for eating meaning. For a still life painter, on the other hand, that same apple might take on a different meaning based on their strivings, a fit for painting meaning. In essence, Sartre wants to say that we experience a world, but not just a world of objects, a world of meaningful objects. Insofar as each individual experiences the world as meaningful, everybody is a unique creator to their own meaningful world. In this respect, we're all like a creator god. The universe that you experience as intelligible and meaningful is your creation. The downside of this for Sartre is that you are responsible for the entirety of the universe, in much the same way that a creationist thinks God is responsible for the universe. Our moral responsibility in such a world becomes paralyzing. Remember from earlier that every action essentially contains a choice, no matter how concealed that choice is, right? We had the example of choosing to value satiety and therefore eating. For Sartre, every choice embodies a commitment regarding the right thing to do in those circumstances. So, for example, imagine that I'm at an Italian restaurant with some friends and I'm choosing between the four pasta dishes that they have on the menu. One is with pesto, one is with tomato sauce, one is with Alfredo, and one is with butter sauce, right? So when I choose one, say the pesto, I'm not just saying that I prefer the pesto, but I'm espousing pesto as the right choice in those circumstances. Such that if my friend then ordered the Alfredo, they wouldn't just be expressing a different preference. Rather, we'd be disagreeing about what's right. This is a silly example, but Sartre thinks that this dynamic applies to every decision that we make. In making a choice, I not only make a choice for myself, but I declare that choice as the right thing to do for everybody in similar circumstances. This is to say that in every action, I'm creating a universal moral theory for everybody else to follow. Now, I want to make this more tangible with our original analogy of a traveler at a crossroads. The point of this analogy was to display the basic existential predicament of being posed with choices but without a map. Now, imagine the traveler isn't alone. Instead, many other travelers are in his circumstance with him. When one traveler decides which route to go, Sartre's claim is simply that they're declaring which route is right. Having made a choice, they declare that every other traveler should follow them. You might think Sartre is correct because not only are other travelers likely to follow, but if another traveler chooses a direction, it really does seem like they're disagreeing about the right path, not just expressing a personal preference for a different route. For Sartre, if the original existentialist predicament wasn't enough, the responsibility of dictating a universal morality in every action without guidance is absolutely paralyzing. Sartre thinks that there is no solution to this problem. Nothing can guide your freedom, nothing can dampen your responsibility, and nothing can justify your action. Yet, it is our condition to find meaning and to seek purpose. Therefore, the human condition itself is lamentable, and there's no honest way out of it. We are condemned to angst and despair. Sartre tells us what we ought not to do to avoid or deny our freedom, but he doesn't give us a clear positive prescription. However, we know that we're doing something right if we confront absurdity, freedom, and responsibility in our every act. If we act while being viscerally aware of our choices, acting with intentionality, even if we're shaking with terror. For Sartre, freedom is essential to humanity, so we can only be authentically human by facing freedom, absurdity, and by extension, confronting fear all the time. If you're looking for a solution to the fear, the abandonment, dread, and angst of absurdity, Sartre's just not the place to look. He's going to tell you that you're doing something right if you're anxious while navigating choices. Freedom is terrifying, and you don't need to, nor should you, try to avoid choices or the feelings that come along with them. Luckily, if you want a solution, we have the book The Ethics of Ambiguity, written by Beauvoir, who was in very close collaboration with Sartre. They actually had a love affair. They were in a relationship for many years, and they worked very closely. They helped each other with all their work, and they basically had the same basic theory, the one that I just discussed. So, in her book, The Ethics of Ambiguity, Beauvoir takes on the lofty project of establishing an ethical theory consistent with existentialism. Now, before I continue, I want to pause to explain why establishing a morality is so important for the existentialists. Absurdity, as we've talked about all video, is a problem of how to direct our freedom. Ethics and morality is the branch of philosophy that is concerned with telling people how to act. Existentialist philosophers had denied all other moral theories, theological and otherwise. If not the truth claims of the moral theories, they deny the practicality of the moral theories in dealing with various moral dilemmas that we face. So the denial of objective and universal morality is among the primary reasons why absurdity exists for the existentialists in the first place, right? Because we no longer have a guide on how to act. That's the morality's job, and we don't have morality, so we don't have a guide. By creating a morality out of existentialist theory, Beauvoir would not only dodge charges of existentialism as being subjectivist and relativistic, but she would potentially create a solution to absurdity itself. To do this, she must create a moral theory that honors rather than hinders our freedom. To start, Beauvoir counters Dostoevsky's claim that without God, everything is permissible. For Beauvoir, without God, we are entirely responsible for what happens in the world, and we have no guarantees or saviors. We are alone in a world of our own creation, but we're also free to create this world through our actions. Our actions alone are what can shape an improved world, and without acting to do so, an improved world won't come. Thus, we must create the sought conditions of our existence, freedom in hand, now. With freedom as the fundamental fact of our human condition and the only means by which we can create a better world, Beauvoir can sketch a preliminary picture of good and evil for the existentialists. Beauvoir puts freedom as the good and the denial of freedom as the evil. With freedom as the sole moral good, it becomes our moral obligation to ensure the conditions that facilitate universal freedom. For one, this means that we must always remain free ourselves. In other words, we ought not allow ourselves to be determined in the world, passively responding to whatever's around us. We shouldn't use the anxieties of freedom to avoid this obligation. Secondly, in our free action, we ought to affirm the freedom of everybody else. This means that we should always respect and prioritize other freedoms, never using our own freedom to hinder theirs. This rules out all acts of domination, manipulation, exploitation, paternalization, and more. To use Kant's language, we ought always to treat others as an end in themselves and never merely as a means. This means that both taking authority over others or hiding behind the authority of others are both moral offenses. Lastly, Beauvoir provides us an ultimate value, maximal freedom for all, that we can aim for in all actions without needing any of Kierkegaard's absurd reasoning. We can use this ultimate value to guide our actions when presented with choices. For example, in choosing between two jobs where one option exploits other people through cheap labor and the other isn't exploitative, I ought to choose the latter. As for some concrete suggestions, Beauvoir suggests artists and writers as invaluable professions for promoting freedom. The artist-writer type makes other people aware of the conditions that alienate them from or attune them towards their freedom and freedom of everybody. Thus, these roles are particularly ethical in Beauvoir's ethical worldview. This might all seem abstract, away from concrete reality, but I'm going to try to make the case that it's not so abstract as it initially seems. To do this, I'm going to put all four philosophers together for some concrete advice on how to approach life by the existentialists. Your freedom makes you you. It's what dictates who you are now and has determined who you were at every step of your journey. In your present state, freedom provides you the possibility to do something great, something destructive, or nothing at all. This responsibility to choose what to do is terrifying, and there's no way around that fear. Most people will be so scared of creating their own path through life, making their own choices at each and every crossroads without a guide, that they'll avoid their freedom. They'll follow someone else or just do what they're told. As a result, they prevent themselves from becoming, from experiencing life to its fullest, not in spite of, but through the bizarre condition that we find ourselves in. The way to approach life is through your freedom at this very moment. Not in an hour, not tomorrow, not in 10 years, but now. To recognize everything you can and want to do and to simply make a choice. If you get nothing else from watching this, I hope that you click off this YouTube video and step into the world with the realization that each moment is wide open with choices. Whatever has happened in your life up to this moment doesn't determine who you are or what you do in the next moment. Embrace the uncertainty of the now and try something new. If that's too scary, choose a value, whether courage, creativity, revolting absurdity, or freedom for all, and ask yourself in every moment, how can I bring this value into being? Let your actions speak of your commitments, and navigate life freely and with purpose. This journey isn't about finding yourself walking some preordained path. It's about creating your own, moment by moment, through actions that honor who you seek to be. If you're not a little scared, you're probably not doing it right.